Good morning. We're glad you're with me today. I enjoy being in your home, sharing this lesson with you. I hope you'll enjoy it as well. Today we are in John chapter 8. It's an interesting situation that we're going to look at today in many ways, things that we all need. But as we get started today, I wanted to take you on a trip to my boyhood home of Santa Fe, New Mexico. In Santa Fe, there's a little chapel called the Loretto Chapel. And the Loretto Chapel was established by Franciscan priests back in the 16th century. It's been there a long time, but its main feature is not its history or its heritage. Instead, it is a spiral staircase. The staircase is unusual because it is so small and it has very little depth to it, but it goes straight up in a spiral. When you go up it, you have to be very careful because it is so steep. But it looks like a corkscrew. And you don't know where it ends and where it begins if you were to look at it from the top of the view. And in a way, that's what we're doing today with John chapter 8. When John speaks in John chapter 8, when he writes of Jesus, but the gospel is one of those things that it kind of goes around and around and around. And you don't know if you're making progress or not. But with every step you take, you get closer to the goal that John wants you to have, which is to decide, is Jesus really the Christ? There are twists and there are turns. There's a spiral here, a spiral there. You keep climbing staircases. There's more to it. And so today we're going to basically climb uh, one stair at a time through our study together. Because John 8 adds something to this whole situation that we've been looking at since John chapter 1, in which he begins by saying, in the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was God. And in the end, he'll say, these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Son of God. How do you get it through there? You climb them one step at a time. But as we get started this morning, first of all, I want to take a detour. Now, the reason I take this detour is very simple. A lot of times we come to the Bible, we start studying the Bible, and we come across something as we read a Bible translation, and we go, I don't understand what that means. This is one of those places where I wanted to pause for a moment to give you just a few hints about what to look for in Bible study, how to evaluate something. I think it's a valuable skill. I think it helps us understand things. In John chapter 8, beginning with 7 verse 53, we read of the story of the woman caught in adultery. We have talked about that story for years. We have preached about that story. We've done everything about it. If you read the King James Version when you were growing up, as I did, you had no problem at all. This was just part of John. It rolled from one to another, and it was just part and parcel. 752 was followed by 753. 811 was followed by 812, and it was just the same way it always had been. And we sometimes look at these things and say that's the way it is. But then, as time went on, the Bible was translated into modern language using more of the discoveries of linguistics and of archaeology to establish the text. And so you come with this, just the English Standard Version, for instance, which is what I usually use in these programs. In the English Standard Version, there is this heading that says, the earliest manuscripts do not include 753 through 811. Now, if you go to the New American Standard Bible, which has a very strict, very conservative way of translating Scripture, it says later manuscripts add the story of the adulterous woman, numbering it as John 7:53 through 8:11. In other words, if you peel back the layers in time, was it really there in the first place? The question we have to ask is the right question. The wrong question, I think, is this in the Bible? That's a whole different issue. But I'd like to ask a different question this morning. That question is, did John write this? So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the process that has gone through. There is a process by which things took place. For instance, John would write the Gospel of John under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. It was inspired and inerrant in its original manuscripts, the way John wrote it. But the problem was you wrote on parchment with a quill pen, and there was no printing press. There was no way to replicate things. So what would have to happen is they would have to be copied by hand. And it was tedious and it was confusing. And sometimes things crept into those copies. Sometimes it was like you left out a word because your eye skips it. That's what happens when we read sometimes. Or there is that concept that says, well, I look at it and then all of a sudden your eye goes back to another line, the line that you had before, and it gets repeated. For some, though, they would come and say, we have been hearing this story in church for so long. I think this is where it belongs. And so they write it in there and include it. And over time, those manuscripts that have been copied and copied and copied and copied through all the centuries of time become the basis for translations. And in English, they started being used in translations. And in the 1600s, the King James Version came out. When the King James Version came out, they used the manuscripts they had available to them at their time. But we now read translations that are about 300 years newer than that, and more things have been discovered, more things have been looked at and compared, and now we have manuscripts that go back in the Gospel of John, for instance. There's at least a fragment or part of a manuscript that is from the 2nd century, which is really the generation after John dies. That's about as close to the original as you get, but it's still copy. But the new versions, because they've utilized newer manuscript evidence, know this wasn't there farther back you go. So how do we make sense of this? Well, let's start with the text. When I was in college, I took Greek my first year in college. Now, Greek will turn you inside out, let me tell you. The language is different. The syntax is really strict. You have to learn a lot. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. I took it at 8 o'clock in the morning on Monday through Friday, and I was bleary-eyed enough at 8 o'clock without having to add Greek to it. And so you learn just kind of little things. You learn about how verbs function and what the tenses are and what these various words are. And you got a very, very simple vocabulary. So you come back from Christmas break, you go into class in the second semester, and they say, you're ready to read the text of the New Testament in Greek. And you go, what? I can barely know my own name, much less read the Greek New Testament in its own language. They said, don't worry. We're going to start you easy. We're going to start with the Gospel of John. John has these short words. John has very simple language, very short, very uncomplicated sentences. With only a few weeks of training, you could read the Gospel of John in Greek. And that's what we did. And we would read through the Gospel of John, and we would read through all the things we've been studying about in the last several weeks. And then all of a sudden, you came to John chapter 8. And it was like getting hit with a brick. The words were difficult. They were unknown. They weren't anything else we had read in the Gospel of John. The sentences were complex. They didn't make a lot of sense. And you go, what happened to John? And it became very apparent that John didn't put those words on that page. It is like, let me compare it to this way. Suppose you have a third grader who comes home and he says, I need to write a theme, a one-page theme. And so he writes this theme, and it is absolutely like a third grader writes it. And daddy comes home and he says, let me see your theme. He takes the theme, he looks at it, he says, let me help you with this a little bit. And so he takes your theme and he rewrites it. And now that theme sounds like it's been written by adults rather than a third grader. That's exactly what happens in John 7:53 through 8:11. It sounds much more like a parent wrote it than a third grader. That's how complicated it is. That's how difficult the language is. And you go, something happened here. And so if you take, first of all, that idea, then couple it with context, we begin to get some clarity about this. Uh, First of all, the context here, if you go back to John chapter 7, Jesus is at the Feast of the Tabernacles, and we're going to talk about more of that in just a moment. He goes to the temple and he begins teaching. That's according to John 7 and verse 14. As he's teaching on the last great day of the feast, Jesus stands up and he begins to say various things, one of which is, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. We're going to cover that in a moment. And then all of a sudden, when you move to chapter 8, the first 11 verses are outside with the Pharisees doing something else. And then you come back to chapter 8 and verse 12, and it says, again, Jesus spoke to them saying, again? This seems like a continuance of what took place in chapter 7, verse 37. He's speaking a second time. And then you come down and it says in chapter 8 and verse 20, these words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple. It gives you all those pieces. What it appears to have happened is chapter 7 and verse 52 pick up at chapter 8 and verse 12. And if you lifted out 753 through 811 and discarded it, it makes perfect sense. That seems to be the way that John wrote it. So, what do we make out of all of this? The one thing we do know is that segment, the first 11 verses of John 8, were found in no other manuscript until you get to the 12th century. Perhaps it was the oral tradition that had attached itself to this gospel, that this story had been told over and over again, and that Jesus did these things and somehow he got hooked to John's gospel. I'm not saying Jesus didn't do them, but the question is this part of what John's gospel looks like? Apparently they were added by a scribe in the Middle Ages to satisfy the need to have a place to put this story. Now, there are some other places they put it in the end of the book of Luke, for instance. There's not even consistency there. But because it was in the King James Version that we all read for so many years, that I grew up reading, that was quoted and taught from pulpits, we accepted that as being part of John's gospel. But if you look at the language, if you look at the sentence structure, if you look at the context, if you look at the flow, if you look at all the things that we've looked at this morning, you have to conclude one thing, and that is that John did not write it. Again, it sounds a lot like Jesus, and Jesus probably did something like that, and it may have been the oral tradition that finally got written down. And as long as we teach it that way, and just have that, not as the Gospel of John, but an incident in the life of Jesus, I'm okay with that. I cannot tell you that it's not inspired, but I can tell you this, that from the evidence we have, John didn't write it. So, let's get back on the main road for a moment, and let's move on with John chapter 8. In John 8, John has this interesting issue that he does, and that is he has, as a feature of his gospel, I am statements. For instance, in John chapter 6, we saw where he said, I am the bread of life. And then in the last chapter, he talked about the living water. In this one, he's going to do this again, but in two particular ways that really tighten the screws to those who are on the fence about who he is. The first is he says, I am the light of the world. He says again, this is verse 12, again, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Now, all of this takes place in a context, a historical setting of something that's taking place at a current time that Jesus speaks of. And it's always important to let it sit in the place in life it sits and talk about it from there. This took place as part of the Feast of the Tabernacles. We talked a little bit about that last week. We'll talk about it again this week. And so you go back to verse 10, and it says, now for the Jews, this feast of the booths, or the feast of the tabernacles was at hand. And so Jesus went up privately, not publicly. Now there are a lot of features to the feast of the tabernacle. They lived out in these little huts adjoining their homes so they could recreate the wilderness experience where God had to take care of them. And if you think about all the things that Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy tells us about that thing, there were a couple of things that happened. They would get thirsty and they would need water. And so Moses would either speak to the rock or strike the rock. There was also that moment that they needed guidance and they needed the presence of God at night. And so there was this pillar of fire at night that settled over the tabernacle. And you have to take all of these pieces together because we're not of the Jewish mindset, but we got to kind of put ourselves back into it. One of the features that took place during the Feast of the Tabernacles was something called the rejoicing at the place of the water drawing. What would happen is the priest would go, he would draw large amounts of water and pour it over the great altar of the temple. It was a way of expressing gratitude for God giving them water, both to drink and sustain their lives, and for their crops to give them a harvest because they're celebrating a harvest. And so there was this idea of water flowing out as the source was God Himself. He gave us the water. So then, when you come to chapter 7, verses 37 to 39, that we looked at a little bit last week, he says, if anyone thirst, let him come to me and drink. And whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. Now, it's hard to miss something here. If God's the one that is giving the waters to sustain, but Jesus says, I'll give him something to drink, he's either taking the place of God or he is God. Interesting little thing that he says there. Huh. They're thinking, he says he gives us water? I thought God did that. Which brings us to chapter 8 that we're going to look at right now. The other feature of the Feast of the Tabernacles was on the last night it was completely dark. Remember, during the first century, they didn't have electric lights. They lit with torches, but they put all their torches out. And there were these large, huge, humongous torches that were in Jerusalem, and they would light those torches, and it would be as bright as day because the light was being given off. In fact, they would read passages that would tell them what the significance was. Isaiah chapter 60, verses 19 and 20, or Zechariah chapter 14, 6 through 7. No longer will you have the sun for the light by day, nor brightness will be the moon give you light. For you will have the Lord for an everlasting light, and the days of your mourning will be over. See, that was part of being read. That's what's going on around Jesus. So suddenly, he says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the life of life. You can see the image in Exodus of that pillar of fire guiding them through the darkness. Jesus says, I am the light. I am the one that gives guidance. I am the one that gives illumination. I am the one that shows you what life is like rather than the darkness. I am the light of the world. See, if God was the light in the desert, Jesus is the light. Who is he? And what is he really trying to say? See, this creates some interesting issues with this because the Pharisees complained. They said, look, all you're doing is spouting off about yourself. He says, they say to him, you're testifying about yourself. But Jesus responds by saying, I am there that the law requires that for anything to be verified takes the testimony of two people to be true. So he says in John chapter 8, verse 16, I am the one who bears witness about myself, and my Father who sent me bears witness about me as well. And they ask the question, where's your Father? And he says, you neither know me nor my Father, for if you knew me, you would know my Father also. Jesus is saying that this is true because I have said it and my Father verifies it. Who's your Father? If you have seen me, you have seen the Father, and if you don't know the Father because you don't know me. He puts them all together in a nice tight knot where they can't get away from it. But do not misunderstand what Jesus is saying. The source of water and the source of light is God, but I am that source. A pretty starch thing to say to people who believe only in one God and that he'll never be on earth that way. But he is pulling these pieces together. And then we move on to a statement that is made that sounds similar, but it has so much more meaning to it. I am. Jesus tells them, he said, if you abide in my word and truly my disciples, these are people who already believe in him, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. Now, we use that pretty freely in a lot of things. Uh, they protest, said, but we're the offspring of Abraham and we've never been enslaved to anyone. How is it you can say you will become free? Now, I find that laughingly absurd for them to say that. But I think I also understand what they mean. You know, they had been enslaved before. They think about Egypt. They were enslaved in Egypt. Think about when they went to Babylon. They were enslaved in Babylon. Even think about the Romans that they live in right at that time. They are dominated by the Roman armies. How can they say they're not enslaved? I think this is what they mean. If you go to Galatians chapter 4, for instance, you hear how rabbis have argued the point. And when they talk about being the offspring of Abraham, you have to hear something about it. When Paul writes in Galatians 4, he talks about two different kinds of people. He talks about the slave woman, Hagar, and the free woman, Sarah. And he makes the point, says, we are the children of the free woman, not the slave woman. I think what this may mean is we are descendants of Abraham, not through Hagar. We always have freedom. We were never of the slave woman. We're his offspring. And we have that kind of freedom from things. And that idea is kind of enmeshed in all of this. And so they do the one thing to Jesus that is the easiest thing in the world to do. If you have an opponent that you do not know what else to do and you can't reason the thing out, and that is to make sure you call them a name. You demonize them. And anytime I see in American politics today the concept where they just kind of launch off in a personal attack, that means they have weak thinking, by the way, because you don't do that if your thinking's good. It's the cheapest, easiest way to dismiss someone. And people tend to listen to it because they haven't thought about what it means. But the Jews, it says in John chapter 8, verse 48, answers, are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? I want you to think about what that means. You have a double whammy problem. You're a demonic-filled Samaritan. I find that humorous as well because in chapter 7, they have already said You are from Galilee, not from Bethlehem. They knew where he was, and yet here they hung a pejorative on him to make him an absolute outsider who could not be what he says he is. But Jesus answers, I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. You do not, yet I do not seek my own glory, for there is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. There's only one person who's going to glorify me. A big theme in John. If you keep my word, you will never see death. How could someone say that? And that's what the rulers were thinking. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died, and the prophets who died? Who do you make yourself out to be? Said, if the righteous among us have all died, what are you to say that you can take away death? They're thinking in a very human way. We look and say, well, how can they miss that? Because they didn't read the end of the story like we have. If Abraham, the father of the faithful, has died, if the prophets who are the representatives of God, if they've died, how can you say that you're going to give people freedom from death? And then Jesus really confuses the situation. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. In other words, he told me this would be a glad day for him. He saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to him, you're not even 50 years old. How can you say you've seen Abraham? They make a point. You say you talked to Abraham, but he's not. He's been dead for a long time. You're not even 50 years old. But then he says, truly, truly, one of these important statements, truly, truly, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. That must have hit them hard because it has so much significance. When you go back to the story of Exodus chapter 3, where Jesus comes to Moses in the desert and the bush is burning, but the leaves are green and not being burned up, but there is this flame. And God says, I want you to go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And Moses makes all these excuses. One of the excuses is, how are they going to know I talked to you? He says there in Exodus chapter 3, verses 13 and 14, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the Lord of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, well, then what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God says to Moses, I am who I am. Say that to the people. I am sent me to you. That's a powerful statement in the rhetoric and the history of Israel. It is called the Tetragrammaton. It is unpronounceable. Understand these four characters in Hebrew say, I am. And for the Jews, they kept the name sacred to the point that they would not say it. Now, brief explanation about how the Hebrew language works. Don't want to go into this great detail. But the Hebrew language has no vowels to it. It's only consonants. And so the way you learn to say it is to repeat words, much like a child repeating words a parent teaches him. And they never had vowels. But they would speak names, but they would not speak this one. Because if they mispronounced it, they felt they would be guilty of taking the Lord's name in vain. And so they never pronounced it. Instead, when they came to it, they said, the Lord. That's how they did it. The Lord. The Lord? Yeah, the Lord. But that's not what that says. The Lord, the word for Lord is Adonai. But over time, they begin to lose the ability to speak the language. what happens to a lot of cultures. The Navajo Indians are that way today. And so there was a group of scholars and scribes around 1000 AD called the Masoretes. And the Masoretes, to ensure the Hebrew text could be read, put little pieces, little dots and pointers on the text as vowel points, as the vowels that were there. But because this was a holy word, they put a different set of vowels. They used the vowels for Lord, and it comes out in English, Jehovah. It's not a real name. It is a mashup of some things. But this was the holy word. This was the name of God. You didn't use the name of God. And yet Jesus says, I am. No wonder it got such a reaction. People. Because it says in the last verse of chapter 8, they picked up stones to throw at him. It was the ultimate blasphemy to say, I myself am God. That's exactly what Jesus said. I am. But he leaves quickly. His time is not yet. There will still be things to be said and taught, and the day will come when they will not need stones to put him to death. So what do we learn today? First of all, I think that Jesus is really forcing a decision in these passages. And that's true about everything. They if for instance he said he is who he says he is, he says, I have come as the Son of God's Son with his authority and power. And he's either that or the worst blasphemer in history. See, there's a problem here that we Jesus doesn't leave room for the concept of he's a good man. He just doesn't. I like what C.S. Lewis says. C.S. Lewis said there are only three positions you can hold toward Jesus. Number one, if Jesus says he is the Son of God, and he really believes he is, but he's not, then he's a crazed lunatic that needs to be in a straitjacket in an asylum someplace, and only a fool follows someone like that. No one's going to lay their life down for a lunatic. Or if Jesus says he's a son of God, but he knows he's not, then he is the worst possible liar and deceiver, and you need to run as fast as you can from him. But the third is, if Jesus is the Son of God, and he really is, then you need to move heaven and earth to follow him. There is no middle ground left. We either believe him, believe that he's the Son of God, and find the ultimate freedom from sin and death and ourselves, or we reject him and we remain shackled in our own problems. So the question we always have to ask of us is, if Jesus were to ask you for the decision, what is it going to be for you? Thank you for joining me today. I hope we've enjoyed what we've done today. I know I have, and I hope to see you again next week as we continue our study in John chapter 9. So have a great day.